There are moments when the machinery of society, the invisible gears and levers that keep our daily lives in motion, suddenly grind to a halt. Moments when the fragile consensus between those who labour and those who govern shatters. May 1926. Britain, still nursing the wounds of the Great War, found itself paralysed by the most dramatic industrial action in its history. For 9 days, nearly 2 million workers laid down their tools. The trains stopped, the presses fell silent, the docks emptied. They called it the General Strike. But it was more than a labour dispute. It was a moment when Britain stood at a crossroads, when questions of class, power, and the very nature of democracy hung in the balance. This is the story of those 9 days that shook Britain to its core. A story of solidarity and division, of power and resistance. A story whose echoes still resonate through time. To understand the General Strike, we must begin where it truly started, deep beneath the rolling hills of Britain, in the coal seams that powered an empire. Coal was Britain's lifeblood, the foundation upon which its industrial might was built. By 1926, nearly 1.25 million men worked in the coal industry, extracting the black gold that heated homes, powered factories, and drove the naval vessels that patrolled an empire spanning a quarter of the globe. Yet those who extracted this vital resource lived lives of grinding hardship. Mining was not merely an occupation, it was an identity, a culture, a way of life passed from father to son. Communities formed around the pit head, their rhythms dictated by the shift whistle. The work was dangerous and debilitating. Men descended into the earth before dawn, working in darkness, broken only by the dim light of safety lamps. They crawled through tunnels barely high enough to accommodate their bodies, wielding picks in spaces so tight they could scarcely swing their arms. The air they breathed was thick with coal dust that settled in their lungs, leading to pneumoconiosis, black lung disease, a condition that claimed countless lives. In mining villages across Wales, Scotland, and the north of England, the structure of life was dictated by the coal industry. Rows of identical terraced houses, often built by the mine owners themselves, curved along hillsides. The physical landscape of these communities reflected their economic dependency. The pithead dominated the skyline, just as coal dominated their existence. This dependence created a powerful collective identity. The Miners' Federation of Great Britain, formed in 1888, became one of the strongest trade unions in the country. Mining communities developed a culture of mutual support, born of necessity. When accidents occurred, when illness struck, when wages fell short, they relied on each other. This solidarity wasn't merely ideological, it was essential for survival. The First World War had temporarily boosted coal demand, but with peace came crisis. Britain emerged from the Great War victorious but crippled by debt. The national debt had increased tenfold. Unemployment, which had been negligible before the war, rose to over 2 million by 1921. For the coal industry, specific problems emerged. Foreign competition increased as countries like Poland and Germany expanded production. The United States had seized many of Britain's export markets during the war. The British government's decision to return to the gold standard in 1925 made British exports, including coal, more expensive on world markets. At the same time, alternatives to coal were becoming more prevalent. Oil-powered ships were replacing coal-burning vessels. Hydroelectricity was expanding. The coal industry, which had seemed eternally secure, suddenly faced an uncertain future. And the structure of the industry itself posed problems. Britain had over 1,500 coal companies, operating some 3,000 mines. Many were small, inefficient, and poorly capitalized. Unlike in Germany or the United States, British coal production had not modernized significantly, relying more on abundant labor than on mechanical extraction. And the mine owners, many of them distant figures, who rarely set foot in the communities their decisions shaped, faced a choice: accept lower profits or reduce the wages of their workers. For the miners, the post-war years brought a roller coaster of hopes and disappointments. In 1919, the Sankey Commission had recommended nationalization of the mines, but the government rejected its findings. In 1921, on what became known as Black Friday, the transport and railway unions refused to strike in support of the miners, who were forced to accept wage reductions. The memory of this betrayal remained fresh as a new crisis developed. In 1925, when mine owners again announced wage reductions, the transport and railway workers stood firm in support. The government, unprepared for a confrontation, provided a 9-month subsidy to the coal industry a temporary measure that became known as Red Friday. But this was merely postponing the inevitable confrontation. With the effects of the Russian Revolution still reverberating across Europe, many saw the idea of organized labor as a threat to national order and security. As the subsidies' expiration approached in April 1926, the mine owners delivered their ultimatum. Miners must accept longer hours and lower wages, a reduction of 13% on average, and far more in some districts. Behind this ultimatum lay a report by the Samuel Commission, established by the government to examine the coal industry's problems. It had recommended reorganization and rationalization of the industry, concluding that some wage reductions were inevitable in the short term, though it rejected longer hours. When the findings were published in March 1926, the miners' leader, A.J. Cook, famously responded, "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day." It became the rallying cry of the dispute, printed on banners and chanted at demonstrations across the coalfields. Cook embodied the militant spirit of the miners. A former Baptist lay preacher who had converted to socialism, he combined evangelical fervor with class consciousness. A powerful speaker, he could move audiences with his passionate defense of the miners' cause. For men already struggling to feed their families, the proposed wage reduction was not merely a reduction in income, it was an existential threat. Average weekly earnings for miners had already fallen from £6 in 1920 to less than £3 in 1926. In some districts, particularly South Wales, wages were even lower. The stage was set for a confrontation. But what transformed a coal dispute into a general strike? For that, we need to understand the solidarity that bound British workers together in this moment of crisis. The Trades Union Congress, the coordinating body for Britain's trade unions, had pledged to support the miners if negotiations failed. As April turned to May and talks collapsed, they faced their moment of truth. Ernest Bevin, the powerful leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, was among the strongest advocates for supporting the miners. He understood that the coal dispute had implications for all industrial workers. If the miners could be forced to accept lower wages and longer hours, other industries would soon follow. As April 1926 progressed, negotiations between the miners, the mine owners, and the government grew increasingly tense. The TUC established a strike committee and began preparations for industrial action. The government, meanwhile, was making its own preparations. A pivotal moment came on April 30th, when printers at the Daily Mail refused to print an editorial entitled "For King and Country," which they viewed as inflammatory anti-union propaganda.
Today, democracy can ebb away in communities whose citizens allow power to become concentrated in the hands of bosses.
What I say goes, see? I'm the law around here.
The government seized on this incident as evidence of revolutionary intent, breaking off negotiations. The editorial had indeed been provocative, calling the proposed strike a revolutionary move which can only succeed by destroying the government and subverting the rights and liberties of the people. The printer's refusal to set these words in type would become a turning point in the escalation of the conflict. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin declared that the printer's action represented an attack on the freedom of the press and evidence of a broader threat to constitutional government. In reality, it was a relatively minor industrial action, but it provided a pretext for breaking off negotiations at a critical moment. On May 1st, 1926, with no agreement reached, the miners were locked out of the pits. 2 days later, the TUC called for a general strike in their support. The notice was brief. All trade unionists, other than those exempted, called to cease work as from Monday night, May 3rd. Britain held its breath. Dawn broke on May 4th, 1926. As Britain awoke, it found itself transformed. The railways were silent. No newspapers rolled off the presses. Buses remained in their depots. Docks stood empty. Power stations operated at minimum capacity. Nearly 2 million workers had laid down their tools. Transport workers, printers, dockers, iron workers, steel workers, builders, electricians, all in support of the miners' cause. The TUC had been selective in its strike call, focusing on key industries that would maximize pressure while minimizing public hardship. Workers in essential services like water, electricity, and gas were instructed to maintain minimum services. food distribution was to continue, with unions issuing permits for transport of essential supplies. Hospital workers remained at their posts. This was not an attempt at revolution. The TUC was explicit that the strike was purely industrial in nature, aimed at supporting the miners in their dispute. Their goal was to force the mine owners and the government back to the negotiating table, not to overthrow the established order. But the government saw things differently. Prime Minister Baldwin wrote, "The general strike is a challenge to Parliament and is the road to anarchy and ruin." Might this be the case? Could the embers of class struggle ignite into flames that would reach across continents? Far to the east, in the corridors of the Kremlin, Soviet leaders watched with calculating eyes. For them, this was not merely a labor dispute in a foreign land, it was a moment pregnant with revolutionary potential. The Soviet leadership immediately classified it as the English affair, a clinical term for what they hoped might become the spark of worldwide revolution. The Politburo first discussed the strike on 4th May 1926, the day after its announcement. It was top of its agenda. Present were General Secretary of the Red International of Labour Unions, Alexander Lazovsky, Secretary of the Executive Control Commission of the Communist International, Osip Piatnitsky, and Foreign Commissar Georgy Chicherin. By the 6th of May, head of the Comintern, Grigory Zinoviev, had joined the discussion, along with Director of the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions, Mikhail Tomsky. The following day, they would be joined by Stalin himself. While no grand subversive plans were set in motion, the Communist Party of Great Britain was directed to agitate against the state, while a commission, including Leon Trotsky, was established in Paris to coordinate aid. From then on, Moscow flowed with what the British government would soon denounce as red gold. First 250,000 rubles, then 2 million more. Much to the chagrin of the Soviets, the TUC refused these funds, but the desperate miners' union accepted them with open hands. But it was on the 3rd of June, 1926, behind closed doors, that the true drama unfolded. For 6 hours, the Soviet Politburo engaged in a ferociously combative debate. It is noteworthy that Stalin was on vacation at this time, Zinoviev likely thinking that this was the perfect time to gain political capital. On one side stood the united opposition, Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, arguing that the Anglo-Russian Committee was a reformist betrayal of revolutionary principles. On the other, the Politburo majority, defending pragmatic engagement with British trade unions. A quadrille with the dead, Zinoviev called it, this dance with reformist trade unions instead of revolutionary masses. But his opponents countered that in Britain's unique conditions, with its young and limited Communist Party, the trade unions were the only realistic vehicle for revolution. With rising temper and fiery rhetoric, Zinoviev condemned Soviet policy as nothing short of treachery against the revolution itself. The alliance with Britain's reformist trade unions, he argued, had blinded them to the truly revolutionary segments of the working class waiting to be mobilized. In his eyes, the TUC General Council were not allies but traitors to the cause. Yet, across the table, his opponents saw a different reality. Britain was not Russia, they insisted. Its Communist Party remained in its infancy, small, inexperienced, lacking deep roots among the masses. The trade unions, despite their reformist tendencies, provided the only viable pathway to reach Britain's workers. Revolutionary purity, they argued, meant little without revolutionary opportunity. When Rykov finished his defense, Zinoviev's response cut through the room like ice. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he accused his opponent of childish simplifications, mere slogans that might impress young pioneers, but had no place in serious revolutionary discourse. The venom in his voice betrayed more than disagreement. It revealed the widening personal gulf between Soviet leadership factions. Zinoviev produced a document summing up the Politburo's response. His thesis unfurled before the Politburo like a revolutionary banner. The British general strike, he proclaimed, was not merely an isolated labour dispute, but the dawning of a new epoch in the international workers' movement. Europe's revolutionary destiny now hung in the balance, with Britain's suddenly awakened proletariat as its vanguard. These workers, transformed by their 9 days of struggle, stood poised to fulfill their historical mission. With the reverence of a scholar, citing sacred texts, he framed the strike as an inevitable phase in the dialectical progression of the British working class toward revolution. His arguments were carefully buttressed by the prophetic words of Marx, the analytical frameworks of Engels, and the tactical insights of Lenin, a theoretical trinity summoned to bless his vision of Britain's imminent revolutionary transformation. As the echoes of Britain's general strike faded across Europe, within the shadowed corridors of Soviet power, a different kind of tremor was building. Grigory Zinoviev, once a titan in the Bolshevik firmament, found himself caught in the merciless machinery of political evolution. The Politburo had made its decision. Zinoviev would be excised from their ranks, like a fading star being removed from the revolutionary constellation. What was truly remarkable about Zinoviev's position was not that it was wrong, but that it was premature. The policies he advocated would indeed become Soviet doctrine, but only after 1928, after Stalin had consolidated power, after diplomatic relations with Britain had already been severed. Zinoviev's analysis may have been prescient, but in the court of Soviet politics, being right at the wrong time was perhaps the gravest error of all. Zinoviev's belief reflected genuine fear among Britain's ruling class. The Russian Revolution was less than a decade old. Revolutionary movements had briefly seized power in Hungary and Bavaria after the war. Many conservative politicians genuinely believed Britain faced a similar threat. The reality on the ground was quite different. Britain in 1926 was not Russia in 1917. The British Labour movement was reformist, not revolutionary. It sought a better deal within the existing system, not its overthrow. The TUC leaders were moderates who respected constitutional processes even as they employed the strike weapon. The government had been preparing for this moment for months. Contingency plans had been drawn up in anticipation of a strike. The country was divided into 10 regions, each under a civil commissioner with near unrestricted powers. Troops were deployed to protect food deliveries. Armoured cars appeared on the streets of major cities. Warships were anchored in the Thames and the Mersey as visible symbols of state power. The Emergency Powers Act was invoked, granting the government extraordinary authority. Special constables were sworn in by the thousands. And across Britain, volunteers, many from the middle and upper classes, stepped forward to maintain essential services. Students from Oxford and Cambridge drove buses and trains. Society women worked telephone exchanges. Retired military officers organised volunteer labour corps. In London's Hyde Park, a temporary camp was established for these volunteers, complete with canteens and first aid stations. The class dimension of these volunteer efforts was unmistakable. For many middle-class volunteers, participation represented not just patriotic duty, but class solidarity of a different kind, a demonstration that they would not be held hostage by organised labour. The government even produced its own newspaper, the British Gazette, edited by a bellicose Winston Churchill, to counter what it saw as revolutionary propaganda. Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, was among the most hardline members of the cabinet, advocating confrontation rather than compromise. The Gazette adopted a strident tone, portraying the strike as a challenge to constitutional government rather than an industrial dispute. It consistently exaggerated the threat of violence and disorder, creating an atmosphere of crisis that helped justify the government's extraordinary measures. The TUC responded with its own publication, The British Worker. A battle of narratives had begun, with each side claiming to represent the true interests of the country. On the streets, an unusual calm prevailed. Violence was rare, despite dire predictions in the conservative press. When confrontations did occur, they were typically minor, arguments between strikers and volunteers, occasional stone throwing at buses driven by strike breakers. Striking workers organised football matches and concerts. There was a strange, festive atmosphere in many communities, a sense of solidarity and common purpose. In mining villages especially, the strike brought communities together in new ways. Communal kitchens were established, entertainment organised, mutual aid systems developed. Women, who had long been the backbone of mining communities, took on new roles, organising food distribution, running soup kitchens, maintaining morale. In many areas, relations between police and strikers remained cordial. When food trucks passed through picket lines, striking workers often stepped aside, recognising the necessity of maintaining food supplies. But beneath this superficial calm, deeper tensions were emerging. The strike had exposed profound class divisions. As middle-class volunteers took over the jobs of striking workers, resentments grew, and as the days passed, the economic pressure on striking families mounted. Most strikers received no strike pay. Union funds, depleted by earlier disputes, could not support 2 million workers. Savings, meagre to begin with, were quickly exhausted. Yet solidarity held firm. The nation as a whole watched on anxiously. A large loudspeaker broadcasted the latest news every 3 hours on Horse Guards Parade Square in London. But as the ninth day dawned, fractures appeared within the TUC leadership. Moderate voices grew concerned about the strike's legality and the potential for violence, potential realized in isolated incidents. Secret negotiations with the government had been ongoing. And then, on May 12th, without consulting the miners, the TUC General Council called off the general strike. Workers were instructed to return to their posts. For many strikers, the announcement came as a shock, delivered through newspaper headlines rather than their union representatives. Some refused to believe it, continuing to man picket lines until personally informed. The miners felt betrayed. The decision to end the strike was complex. Some TUC leaders genuinely feared that violence would escalate if the strike continued. Others worried about legal action against the unions based on the Trade Disputes Act of 1906, which protected unions only in disputes directly related to their members' employment. Supporting the miners might be deemed illegal sympathy action. There were also political calculations. The Labour Party's leadership, including Ramsay MacDonald, had been lukewarm about the strike from the beginning, fearing it would damage the party's image as a responsible parliamentary opposition. Pressure was exerted on trade union leaders with Labour Party connections to find a face-saving compromise. For rank-and-file union members, the sudden capitulation was bewildering and demoralizing. They had answered the call to strike, made sacrifices, shown solidarity, and now were being told to return to work without any apparent gain. And fight on they did, alone now, for another 7 months, through summer heat and winter cold, until hunger and hardship finally forced them back to the pits in November 1926, accepting longer hours and lower wages. The miners' continued resistance was remarkable for its duration and discipline. Without the support of other unions, they could not prevail against the combined power of the mine owners and the government. By November, with winter approaching and families facing destitution, most were forced to admit defeat. They returned to work under the owners' terms, longer hours, lower wages, district agreements rather than national ones. It was a bitter end to what had begun as a united stand for dignity and fairness. The immediate aftermath of the general strike appeared to be a clear victory for the government and the mine owners. The TUC had capitulated. The miners had been defeated. Workers returned to their jobs, often facing victimization and blacklisting. Many strike leaders never worked in their industries again. Some companies required returning workers to sign documents renouncing their union membership. The balance of power seemed decisively shifted. In 1927, the government passed the Trade Disputes Act, making sympathy strikes illegal and requiring union members to actively opt in to the political levy that funded the Labour Party. It was, in many ways, a legislative punishment for the audacity of the general strike. The act represented a direct assault on trade union power. By making sympathetic strikes illegal, it attacked the solidarity that had been central to the general strike. By changing the political levy system from opt-out to opt-in, it sought to reduce the Labour Party's funding and weaken the link between industrial and political labour movements. For a time, the trade union movement was in retreat. Membership declined. The radical promise of solidarity that had flowered briefly in May 1926 withered in the harsh climate that followed. Yet, in the mining communities, the memory of the strike became part of their collective identity. Songs were written, stories passed down. The betrayal by the TUC leadership became a cautionary tale about placing too much trust in distant officials. The 7 months of continued resistance against impossible odds became a potent symbol of the miners' fierce, indomitable spirit. The legacy of those 9 days proved more complex than a simple defeat. The memory of solidarity, of bus drivers striking for miners they had never met, of communities coming together in adversity, remained powerful. The strike had demonstrated the potential strength of united action, even if that potential had not been fully realized. For the Conservative government, the strike's defeat provided only temporary reassurance. The underlying social tensions remained unresolved. The economic problems that had precipitated the crisis persisted. The Labour Party, despite the blow dealt by the 1927 Trade Disputes Act, continued to grow in strength. Many workers concluded that industrial action alone was insufficient. Political power was also necessary to effect change. When Labour came to power in 1945, with a mandate to build a new society from the ashes of war, many of its policies addressed the inequities that had led to the general strike. The coal mines were nationalised, healthcare made universal, and the welfare state established. For the miners, Nationalisation in 1947 represented a kind of delayed victory. Their industry was now owned by the nation rather than private interests. Working conditions improved. Safety regulations were strengthened. For a time, at least, they enjoyed greater security and respect. The National Coal Board, which took over the industry, invested in modernisation and mechanisation. New mining techniques were introduced. Housing was improved. Mining communities, which had suffered decades of exploitation and neglect, began to see tangible benefits from public ownership. But the fundamental challenges facing the coal industry remained. Alternative energy sources continued to develop. Foreign competition remained intense. The economic logic that had driven the 1926 crisis had not disappeared. It had merely been temporarily suspended by political intervention. When another Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher confronted the miners in 1984, the memory of 1926 shaped both sides' strategies. Thatcher ensured there would be no general strike in support of the miners, dealing with each industry separately. Coal stocks were built up before the confrontation. The police were mobilised on a national basis, overcoming local sympathies. The full power of the state was deployed against the striking miners. The miners, led by Arthur Scargill, fought alone for a year, just as they had in the aftermath of the 1926 general strike, before ultimately facing defeat. This time, the defeat was even more complete. In the years that followed, the British coal industry was systematically dismantled. Today, the British coal industry is all but gone. Where once 1.2 million miners worked, only 268 remain. The physical landscape bears witness to this transformation. Pit heads have been demolished. Spoil heaps have been landscaped. Mining museums now stand where once coal was hewn from the earth. In some former mining areas, unemployment remains stubbornly high. Social problems persist. The sense of community and purpose that mining provided has not been replaced. But the questions raised by the general strike remain urgently relevant. How is power balanced between capital and labour? What obligations do we have to communities shaped by industrial change? What does solidarity mean in a divided society? These questions have acquired new urgency in our era of globalization, automation, and growing inequality. The gig economy has created a new class of precarious workers without traditional protections. Multinational corporations can shift production across borders, weakening labor's bargaining position. Technology threatens to eliminate entire categories of employment. Yet, there are also echoes of the solidarity that motivated the general strike. New forms of labor organization are emerging. Workers in the digital economy are beginning to organize. Concerns about economic justice have re-entered political discourse in ways reminiscent of the 1920s. The disruptions caused by climate change and the transition to sustainable energy sources raise questions about just transitions that echo those of the coal industry's decline. How do we balance the necessity of change with the needs of communities dependent on older industries? Who bears the costs of economic transformation? The 9 days of the general strike were brief, a mere moment in Britain's long history. Yet in that moment, fundamental questions about the nature of British society were thrown into sharp relief. For some, the strike represented a dangerous challenge to constitutional authority. For others, it was a profound expression of working-class solidarity. For most who lived through it, it was perhaps something more ambiguous, a disruption to normal life that revealed how fragile the machinery of society truly is. Today, as technology transforms how we work, as global capital moves with ever greater freedom, as the nature of employment itself evolves, the tensions that exploded in May 1926 continue to shape our world. The miners, who stood firm behind their slogan, "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day," could not know the full consequences of their stand. They sought merely to protect their livelihoods, their communities, their way of life. The general strike may have ended in apparent defeat, but the questions it raised about power, about solidarity, about who bears the cost of economic change, these questions remain unanswered. Perhaps they always will be, for they speak to something fundamental about how we organize our societies, how we distribute hardship and prosperity, how we balance individual interest against collective good. 9 days in May 1926. 9 days that revealed the fault lines running beneath British society. 9 days whose echoes continue to resonate almost a century later.